Hello, and thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to share some thoughts with you today at this On-MERRIT webinar. I'm afraid that due to job changes I've had to deviate from my originally proposed topic and provide a pre-recorded session for today's webinar. So I'm going to be talking about bibliometrics, the Matthew effect and its impact on diversity in academia. And this talk is a version of one I originally gave to the Finnish Bibliometrics seminar in September 2020. So if you were there, you will have heard most of this before, and you may wish to go and tidy your sock drawer instead. So what I want to do today is explore the role bibliometrics plays in exacerbating the Matthew effect in academia, thus mitigating against diversity. And just so we're on the same page, the Matthew effect describes the increasing concentration of wealth in the hands of a decreasingly small proportion of the population based on the Gospel of Matthew in the Bible. So I hope to take you on a bit of a journey to consider firstly what the Academy rewards and the consequences of that, and then to think about what the Academy really values and why it's so hard to measure what we value and why we so often fall back on bibliometrics. And then I'm going to ask if that's actually a bad thing, and I'll finish by drawing some conclusions. So in April this year, the Confederation of Open Access Repositories put out a call for bibliodiversity, which they saw as an essential characteristic of an optimal scholarly communication system. And they included within that definition diversity in evaluation measures. Because of course, unless we have a diversity of people evaluating a diversity of things via a diversity of mechanisms, we're not going to engender a more diverse research ecosystem that ultimately better serves our diverse world. But of course, we don't have that right now. Earlier this year at the King's College Open Research Conference, Marcus Manafo of the University of Bristol summed up the situation brilliantly with this slide. He said, scientists are incentivised to publish, particularly in certain journals, obtain grant funding, and that was the end of the list. And of course, you could argue that funding only really counts because it leads to publications. But we all know it's not just any publications that count, it's journal articles. So this chart shows submissions to the UK research assessment exercise, as it was, between 1996 and 2008 in different fields. And you can see the proportion of journal articles, the red bars, went up pretty much every time, even in the humanities subjects. We also know that in 2014, over 80% of the outputs, all of the outputs submitted to REF, the Research Excellence Framework in the UK, were journal articles. But it's not just any journal articles that we reward, it's those with an exciting story to tell. So this study looked at the cumulative effect of reporting and citation biases on what eventually ends up in the scholarly record. So they started with all of the clinical trials registered relating to the treatment of depression, that's on the left-hand side, and the red dots on the bar A on the left-hand side show the proportion of negative trials, those that found no positive results, relative to those that did find positive results, the green dots. The next bar shows the proportion of those positive and negative trials that actually made it into the literature at all. The next bar shows a proportion of those published studies that actually focused on those negative findings. The next shows the proportion of published studies that put a positive spin on those negative findings. And the final bar shows which of those studies ultimately got cited by resizing the dots according to citedness. And from this we can conclude that there is absolutely no citation glory, the tiny red dots on the right hand side, to be found in negative trials, no matter how absolutely critical they are to scholarship and our understanding of the world. And of course, the more sinister issue here is that this can give us a false impression about what's true. So this example shows that 95 out of 100 studies found no association between autism and brain region, but 5 did find a positive result, a false positive result. And of course, those 5 got published. So now when you do a search for autism and cerebellum, you find 1 negative and 5 supporting studies, which is deeply problematic. And of course, one of the reasons we only publish positive studies is that more prestigious journals, and I use that in scare quotes there, won't touch negative studies because they don't get cited. And we have to publish in prestigious journals because most hiring committees are looking for publications in prestigious journals, as this study of US promotion and tenure criteria found, where 40% of US research intensives had requirements around journal impact factors or brands, not discussing the proportion of US research intensives or other universities that had this requirement in their heads but not on paper. And the problem with prestigious journals is that they are mainly closed or hybrid. So the Web of Science boasts that 23% of the papers they index have a free legal green or pure or hybrid gold version in the past 5 years. But by my calculation, that means that 77% are still closed. And of course, Web of Science and Scopus are still the databases that provide many of the bibliometrics, rewarding our publication culture. And those databases, of course, are heavily skewed towards STEM subjects, as this study found last year, where every database they investigated indexed fewer arts and humanities outputs, those at the top of this table, than all the other subjects. And then, of course, you can see that from the Scopus journal selection criteria here, they index mainly titles in English. And then the real proof that your publication has made it is if it's cited. As you can see here, for institutions with Elsevier's SciVal, their measure of a researcher's overall research performance, and notice the title is not publication performance, it's overall research performance. Their indicators for research performance include 5 citation metrics and your publication count. And for those of you who have been following the conversation on List Bibliometrics about Cite, a new service that uses natural language processing to try and discern whether a citation supports or disputes the paper it cites, you will know that in future it may not just be citations that will count, but whether a machine somewhere thinks they are positive. This example is one of my own papers, and the allegedly disputing paper was also written by me and surprisingly does not dispute my earlier work in any way. So to recap, what we currently incentivise in the Academy is journal articles reporting positive results in prestigious journals that are mainly closed or hybrid, that are indexed by commercial bibliographic databases, that are biased towards STEM subjects, written in English and well cited as measured by bibliometric tools. So what might the consequences of only rewarding publications and citations be? Well, surprise, surprise, valuing only one thing leads to a concentration in academic wealth. Firstly, in the scholarly record itself. So far from bibliodiversity, we have bibliohomogeneity, and yes, I made that word up. Smaller independent publishers can't survive, meaning larger conglomerates dominate. There's downward pressure on other, arguably more important outputs from research, such as data, code, protocols, and everything is written in English. And this rather stark image shows the proportion of journals indexed by Scopus from the global north, 81%, versus the global south, 18.4%. Secondly, it leads to a concentration of wealth amongst those actually able to access the scholarly record because it's closed. And of course, as we move towards the scholarly record becoming open by default, it leads to a concentration of wealth amongst those actually able to contribute to the scholarly record because APCs are increasingly aligned with publication metrics. And of course, it also leads to a narrowing of those actually rewarded by the scholarly record. So Indonesia recently introduced a new researcher ranking system that uses the volume of articles and citations from Google Scholar and Scopus for deciding who are the best researchers and for allocating funding to these individuals. And the resulting top 10 looks like this, and the number of women in that top 10 is 1, and the number of researchers in the fields of social sciences, arts and humanities is 0. It's not individual researchers that suffer the homogenising effects of publication-based rankings, of course. All university rankings use the publication record as their main data source. Somebody on Twitter recently pronounced parodying Descartes, we are ranked, therefore we are, to which the excellent Martin Dominic from St Andrews University responded, we are ranked, therefore we are all the same. So what do we actually value? How do we fix this? What's the alternative to publications being the single currency of research credit? Well, of course, it's by returning to what we actually value about research, researchers and research institutions. But it's the first step that's the hardest, and this is the need to start with what you, the evaluator, values and not with what others value. So usually when I do this talk face to face, I ask for a show of hands as to how many institutions have KPIs around climbing the university rankings, at which point about 90% of people raise their hand. But how many of those institutions really believe that the ranking they seek to climb properly represents their institutional mission? But all too often we're driven to measure what third parties value rather than doing the hard work of understanding what it is we actually value ourselves and evaluate accordingly. And of course the other thing we're in danger of is counting only what we can count, i.e. measuring in accordance with the availability of data. This is called the Streetlight effect, as illustrated by this cartoon. Where did you lose your wallet? In the park. So why are you looking here? Because this is where the streetlight is. Many evaluations rely on bibliometric data, not because the volume of publications or even their citedness is what they value, but because it's so readily available to us and so easy to use. So what do we value? Well, more than publication producers. We value a diversity of people. So we know that companies with diverse management teams have 19% higher revenue. Excuse me. We know that inclusive companies are 1.7 times more likely to be leaders in their sector, and 87% of the time diverse teams make better decisions. We value a variety of disciplines. As COVID has shown us, it takes more than medics to fight a pandemic. We need communicators and psychologists and designers and so on. We need a diversity of findings. We need all the results, positive and negative, to make the best decisions. We need a diversity of output types, data, design, sculpture, trade journals, code. I saw this wonderful cartoon on Twitter recently which sums it up beautifully. All modern digital infrastructure rests on a small but highly significant project being maintained by a single person in their bedroom. And of course, if they didn't write a paper on this, it currently wouldn't count for anything. We value a much broader diversity of impact than we currently actually reward, and we value a far greater diversity of researcher activities. This is of course something that the Finnish Guide to Researcher Evaluation seeks to reward, but it's not just diversity that we value. So the Hong Kong Manifesto for Assessing Researchers is a great example here. This seeks to foster research integrity through 5 principles, the last 2 of which, yes, call for diversity, but the first 3 call for responsible research practices such as reproducibility, transparent reporting across all stages of the research process, and open science, not just open access. So the next question we have to ask ourselves is, if we know what we value, and it's not just publications, why don't we just measure and therefore incentivise a broader diversity of things? Isn't that the solution to this problem? Well, maybe. And that's certainly the premise behind things like the Hong Kong principles. But this isn't as straightforward as we think. Firstly, we have to remember that we only value some of these things as a means to an end and not an end in themselves. And I'd put diversity in that category actually, because we don't actually value diversity because we just enjoy seeing a selection of ethnicities and genders around our table, or we like to provide our assessors with a nice variety of output types. We value diversity because it leads to better scholarship, better decisions and better outcomes for humanity. And in some cases, we don't want diversity. We want standardisation of clinical reporting and standardisation of metadata and high standards when it comes to research integrity and quality. And it's the same with open science. Open science is not necessarily better science. It's just a means to better. So we have to ask whether it's more appropriate to measure the means or the end. And of course, some of the things that we value are quite nascent. So open research is another case in point. We have to ask ourselves whether we are ready to measure these things yet. We need to enable some of these things before we can measure them. So here are some of the possible indicators for responsible research practices provided by the Hong Kong Principles Group. And I'm not sure about your institutions, but I think in the UK it's fair to say that we're not yet at a place where these practices are normative. And if you're familiar with Brian Nosek's excellent research culture change pyramid, you may already be persuaded that we need to make things possible and easy and normative before we can start measuring and rewarding them, even if we do value them. That's not to say we can't start experimenting with rewarding these things. And if you look at the DORA website, you'll see a whole raft of different organisational attempts to measure a hugely diverse array of things. But when you analyse those research evaluation innovations, as I've done loosely here, you'll see that the vast majority are around how to evaluate individuals for jobs or projects for funding, i.e. small local evaluation projects well within the jurisdiction of individual institutions. And whilst that's great, if we really want to change research evaluation, we need much more innovation further up the food chain, which leads me to my fourth challenge, and that is that we currently have no global data sources for the diversity of things that we value. So when the Times Higher Education Impact Rankings try to branch out into rankings based on the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, they ended up falling back on, you guessed it, Bibliometrics, and of course the university provided data, which in my view was a bizarre mass act of self-destruction. And then we remember that there were good reasons that we measure publications in the form of bibliometrics. You can count them. The data collection is systematic and global, of course. All disciplines produce them to varying degrees, and they're broadly equivalent, unlike, say, data, where a single unit can vary from a photograph to a 100 million point data set. They are peer assessed, both via peer review and ultimately through citations. And whilst we're unhappy with the over-reliance on publications as the sole measure of research performance, we do actually still value them as a record of scholarship. So if there are useful qualities to bibliometric data, are there ways we can use it to support our diversity cause? After all, if it's good enough for the Times Higher. And I think the answer here is yes. At some levels of granularity, for some purposes, bibliometrics are an essential tool in the toolbox for those seeking greater diversity in research. We've seen some very useful studies, such as this one, which uses bibliometric data to highlight gender disparities in science and help support arguments for greater investment in gender parity. At a more regional level, Professor Alan Dix, who sat on the REF 2014 computing panel, used bibliometrics to sense check the fairness of peer review scores in his discipline, and actually found a 5 to 10-fold bias towards pure research over applied, towards Russell Group institutions, those highly intensive research institutions, versus what we call pre-92 and post-92 in universities, and towards papers by men over those by women. This led him to conclude that whilst metrics were rubbish, people were far worse. And this, of course, is something that we need to bear in mind when we scrutinise the strengths and weaknesses of bibliometrics, that the alternatives, such as peer review, are not entirely unproblematic either. But of course, the other way we can successfully use bibliometric data to support diversity is by incorporating a wider range of data about the things we value into the bibliographic record. So we're starting to see this with things like credit data, which provides a wider view of the contributions made by co-authors. Open access status, so Web of Science now includes this by virtue of unpaywall. Funding information, which helps us understand where research funding is going and how it might be made fairer. Links out to other records relating to the research reported, such as pre-registration, data code, whether or not it adheres to reporting guidelines and so on. And of course, some publishers are starting to include lay summaries and videos to improve the accessibility of those outputs. So this is all good, right? Well, again, maybe. The first challenge here is that any study based on the scholarly record is going to inherit the attributes of the scholarship that record represents. I'll say that again. Any study based on the scholarly record is going to inherit the attributes of the scholarship that that record represents. So we've already seen that bibliographic data is skewed towards positive studies, journal-based disciplines, men, the global north, the English language. And of course, this is becoming more of a problem as we start to use this record as a corpus for natural language processing based evaluations such as Semantic Scholar to train artificial intelligences. It's the garbage in, garbage out problem. But the other big challenge here, I think, is that data is largely owned by big corporations. So many publishers are seeing that the writing is on the wall for their monopoly over publication content and are instead moving into data analytics. So we saw this with the Dutch Elsevier agreement announced late last year, which was along the lines of, you can publish open access in all our titles as long as you work with us to create new data analytics products. And funnily enough, just last week, the Institution of Engineering and Technology, owners of the InSpec database, launched another new analytics offering based on bibliographic data that was once used for discovery and is now being resold as intelligence. So essentially, we're moving from a situation where publishers previously said to us, you know that article you gave me, let me sell it to you, to a situation where they're now saying to us, you know that data you gave me, let me sell it to you. So then when we see announcements like these, that Elsevier is adopting credit for 1,200 journals on the premise that this leads to fairer recognition for researchers, we can't help wondering whether this data is soon going to be packaged up in SciVal and sold back to us so that we can use it for more nuanced evaluations based on researcher contribution. And where does it end? So Elsevier's parent company RELX is buying up data companies at an alarming rate, and Wolfie Crystal posted a rather chilling thread about this on Twitter last month regarding an ominously named RELX product called Threatmetrics, which has data on hundreds of millions of individuals, and apparently captures data from Science Direct about individual engagement with papers. Now, this is not my area of expertise, and I can neither confirm nor deny this, but if it's true, it's pretty concerning, particularly as when institutions that ask for usage data from these products, we are unable to get anything useful due to GDPR. Okay, so I've taken us on a long and winding path exploring many sides of this interesting issue. So to summarise, I've argued that we reward a very narrow subset of the literature, which concentrates academic wealth in the hands of a few We value a much broader range of things actually, but they are hard to measure, so we fall back on bibliometrics. That's not always a bad thing, especially as bibliographic data expands to describe the things that we value, except such data is inherently unrepresentative and largely owned by commercial entities. So I now come back to my title, Bibliometrics and the Matthew Effect. What can we conclude? Should we embrace them or run far, far away? Well, I guess the truth is that bibliometrics are neutral, and really it's our narrow framing of what we value that's often our problem. Or put another way, bibliometrics makes a good servant and a terrible master. We can use them successfully to support greater diversity in the research ecosystem, but they shouldn't direct and dominate our path. But there's no doubt about it, there is a real and pressing need for greater evaluative diversity across the whole research spectrum, from better ways for evaluating the contributions of researchers with things like bio sketches and narrative CVs, and there's a lot of innovation on this area as I mentioned, but we also need innovation to enable evaluative diversity at higher levels of aggregation. So currently, if I wanted to compare, say, Loughborough's engagement with open research with Tampere University, there's absolutely no way that I can do that. You know, we desperately need global community-owned data sources to report on the things that we value, if we want to actually value and monitor our progress towards engaging with a wider range of people, processes and outcomes from research. Thankfully, the Curtin Open Knowledge Initiative are looking at developing a dashboard for openness, and there are other related initiatives such as the initiative for open citations. But of course, funding and governing these community-owned initiatives is challenging, and I'd urge you to support them if you can. But whilst we have to pursue evaluative diversity, if we want to pursue diversity itself, we have to remember that ultimately research evaluation will never be fair until our research environment is fair, until the world is a fairer place and everyone has equal opportunity to participate and to succeed. As research evaluators, we can spend our time correcting for the inherent inequalities in the research ecosystem, considering the context, the discipline, the coverage of our data sets, the limitations of our indicators, or we can seek to correct the actual inequalities in the research ecosystem to level the playing field so that everybody gets a fair chance at making a contribution and having that contribution recognised and valued. So if we really care about diversity, we need to support it both inside and outside our places of work, and I think we need to always bear that in mind. But that's everything from me. I think I said enough. Thank you very much for your patience and for listening. I'm happy to continue the conversation if anyone has any thoughts or comments, either directly or via email and Twitter.